Here's a question that should make you stop whatever you're doing right now. Think of the smartest person you know. Maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's someone you've seen speak on stage or in a boardroom. Now ask yourself, are they the most successful person you know? Probably not, because here's what nobody tells you. Intelligence without communication is a locked vault. You might have the most valuable thing in the world sitting inside your mind, a solution, a vision, a plan. And yet, if you cannot open the vault and hand it to people in a way they can actually receive it, it stays locked forever. The world does not reward the best thinkers. It rewards the best communicators. And that's exactly what we're going to change today. Welcome to Audiobook Mode, where we don't just read books. We decode the ideas that can genuinely transform the way you move through the world. Today, we're going deep on one of the most practical, most life-changing skills a human being can develop. This is how to speak smart. And by the time this audio is done, you're going to think about every conversation, every pitch, every argument, every silence differently. Let's begin. The quiet power that decides everything. Let's start with a simple truth that most people spend decades learning the hard way. Communication is not just a skill. It is a currency. Every interaction you have, when you ask for a raise, when you try to calm down an argument, when you pitch an idea, when you comfort someone who is falling apart, all of it is a transaction. And the quality of what you receive back depends almost entirely on the quality of what you put in. History is filled with brilliant people who were ignored, and it's equally filled with ordinary people who changed the world, not because they were the smartest in the room, but because they could move rooms. Think about Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't born with charisma. He was awkward, gangly, and spoke in a high-pitched voice that surprised people. But he trained himself to communicate with such precision, such emotional truth, such structural clarity, that his words carved themselves into history. The Gettysburg Address, one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered, was only 272 words long. Not clever. Precise? Or think about a modern example. Steve Jobs was not the best engineer at Apple, not even close. But when he stood on that stage and said, "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone," he didn't just announce a product. He reframed reality. He made millions of people feel like they were witnessing the future. And that feeling? That's communication. Now think about your own life. Have you ever had the right idea but the wrong delivery, and watched someone else get credit for a version of the same thought? Have you ever felt your worth wasn't being recognized, even though you were working harder than anyone? Have you ever walked out of a conversation feeling like you said everything but were heard for nothing? That's not a talent problem. That's a communication problem. And the brilliant news is, communication is a learnable skill. Not a personality trait. Not a genetic gift, a skill. Like any craft, it can be studied, practiced, and mastered. And that's what this audiobook is about. We'll explore the frameworks, the psychology, and the practical tools needed to communicate with clarity, confidence, and power. Not to impress people, not to trick them, to actually connect. And in connecting, to genuinely influence outcomes. So let's pull back the curtain, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Chapter O-N-E, Train Your Mind Before You Train Your Mouth. Here's something that will immediately change how you think about communication. Communication does not start when you open your mouth. It starts in your mind. Every word you speak is the surface layer of a much deeper process happening beneath it. And if that deeper process, your thinking, is scattered, reactive, or emotionally hijacked, then no amount of vocabulary training or speaking technique will save what comes out of your mouth. Think about it this way. Imagine a craftsman with a dull blade. He can be the most skilled craftsman in the world. Decades of experience, incredible knowledge, but if his tools aren't sharp, the work suffers. More effort, worse result. A sharp tool doesn't just make the work better, it makes it easier. The mind works exactly the same way. A clear, trained mind produces clear, powerful communication. A foggy, reactive mind produces conversation that confuses, irritates, or alienates, even when the intention is good. So what does it mean to train your mind for communication? The first mental shift, clarity of intent. Before you speak, before a single word leaves your mouth, ask yourself one question. What am I actually trying to communicate right now? It sounds almost too simple, but try it the next time you're about to send an angry email, or wade into a difficult conversation, or prepare to push back on something you disagree with. Most people skip this question entirely. They speak from impulse, from emotion, from habit. They talk and talk and talk, and then wonder why they feel misunderstood. When you know your intention, the words follow naturally. Without a clear intention, words multiply but meaning shrinks. There's a fascinating psychological principle at play here. Researchers at Stanford University found that most people overestimate how clearly they communicate. They call this the curse of knowledge. The idea that once you understand something deeply, it becomes almost impossible to remember what it felt like not to understand it. So you skip steps, you assume shared context, you use shorthand, and the listener gets lost. The antidote is intentionality. Slow down. Ask, what is the single most important thing I want this person to understand or feel from this conversation? Start there. Build from there. Don't scatter. Focus. The second mental shift, emotional regulation. Here's a scene that probably sounds familiar. You're in a meeting. Someone says something that dismisses your idea, or takes credit for your work, or simply gets the facts wrong in a way that reflects badly on you. And before you've even consciously processed what happened, you feel it. The heat in your chest, the sharpness behind your eyes, the sudden need to respond, right now, loudly. That instinct? That's your emotional brain hijacking your communication brain. When we're in an elevated emotional state, something fascinating and terrible happens inside our neurology. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, fires. And when it fires, it essentially takes your prefrontal cortex offline. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for logic, empathy, nuanced thinking, and choosing words carefully. When you're flooded with emotion, you're literally operating with reduced cognitive capacity. This is why things said in anger are often regretted. It's not weakness. It's biology, but biology can be worked with. The key insight from neuroscience here is this: naming your emotion reduces its intensity. Researchers at UCLA found that when you consciously label what you're feeling, I'm feeling frustrated right now, or I'm feeling defensive, activity in the amygdala decreases. The emotional storm quiets, even slightly, and that slight quieting is all the space you need to choose your words instead of firing them. Great communicators don't eliminate emotion. They process it. They feel the frustration, they name it, and then they choose how to express it, rather than letting it express itself through them. The third mental shift, perspective taking. Communication is not a monologue. It's always a dance between what you send and what the other person receives. This sounds obvious, but almost every communication breakdown in history, in relationships, in politics, in business, comes from someone forgetting this. Before you speak, consider, how will this land? What is this person likely to hear, given where they are right now? This isn't about softening your message. It's about routing it intelligently. A GPS doesn't change your destination. It just finds the best path to get there based on current road conditions. Perspective taking is the GPS of communication. You're still going where you need to go. You're just accounting for the terrain. Research by social psychologist Adam Galinsky at Columbia Business School consistently shows that people who take perspective before negotiating or communicating achieve significantly better outcomes, not because they give more ground, but because they find more routes to agreement. The fourth mental shift, self-awareness. This is perhaps the most confronting piece. Most communication problems are not caused by lack of vocabulary or intelligence. They're caused by blind spots. You might be someone who interrupts without realizing it, not because you're rude, but because your mind processes faster than others speak, and you've never had someone hold up a mirror. You might over-explain, burying your point under so many layers of qualification that nobody can find it. You might speak so softly that people assume you lack confidence, even when your ideas are strong. You might default to sarcasm when you feel threatened, without ever consciously choosing it. We all have these patterns, and every unexamined pattern is a leak in your communication pipe, energy and meaning draining out before it reaches the person it's meant for. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is awareness, because once you see the pattern, you have a choice, and choice is where power lives. Think of it this way. A pilot who knows their aircraft's tendencies, the way it pulls slightly left in crosswinds, the way the instruments lag in certain conditions, can correct for them automatically. A pilot who doesn't know these tendencies gets surprised by them. Awareness turns surprises into adjustments. So here is the foundational principle of this entire audiobook. Master the mind first, and the mouth will follow. The words you speak are only as powerful as the thinking behind them. Train your mind to hold clarity. Train it to regulate emotion. Train it to take perspective. Train it to observe its own patterns. Do that, and every other skill we discuss in this book becomes 10 times more effective. Chapter TWO: Master the Art of Mental Framing. Let's talk about a concept that changes the entire way you understand why some conversations go beautifully and others go horribly wrong, even when the information being shared is almost identical. That concept is framing. Framing is the invisible architecture of communication. It's the psychological container that holds your words, and it determines how those words are received before the listener has consciously processed a single syllable. Here's a quick, vivid illustration. In the 1980s, two groups of researchers presented doctors with identical medical statistics about a surgical procedure. One group was told that the surgery had a 90% survival rate. The other group was told it had a 10% mortality rate. Same numbers, same surgery. But the first group recommended the surgery far more often than the second. The frame changed the decision. Now apply that to your daily conversations. When a manager says, "We need to talk about your performance," the word performance in that context triggers anxiety, defensiveness, a kind of psychological crouching. The listener has already begun to protect themselves before a single specific word has been said. But when a manager says, "I want to sit down with you and figure out how to set you up for a win over the next quarter," the frame is entirely different. Same underlying intention. The manager wants to address performance, but one frame opens the listener up and the other shuts them down. One creates partnership. The other creates dread. That's framing. What makes a frame powerful? A frame does three things simultaneously. It sets the emotional tone, it communicates the relationship dynamic, and it establishes what the conversation is about before any specific content is delivered. Most people think conversations fail because of what's said. Actually, they more often fail because of the frame in which it was said. Consider the famous study by linguist George Lakoff, who showed that the way political issues are framed fundamentally shapes how people respond to them, regardless of the underlying data. Tax relief frames taxation as a burden from which citizens need to be freed. Revenue for public investment frames the same money as a collective tool for shared progress, same dollars. Opposite emotional reactions. This isn't manipulation. Framing is unavoidable. Every sentence you speak arrives inside a frame. The only question is whether you're choosing it intentionally or accidentally. The most common framing mistakes. Mistake 1. The accidental adversarial frame. This happens when the opening of a conversation unintentionally signals conflict. "I have a problem with something you did. This isn't working. Why didn't you?" These phrases might all be perfectly valid, but they immediately put the listener in a defensive posture. And once someone is defending, they've stopped listening. The fix is not to avoid difficult topics. It's to open with a collaborative frame. "I want to figure this out with you. I think we can find a better way here. Can I share something I've noticed and get your thoughts on it?" Same difficult conversation, but the listener is now a partner, not a defendant. Mistake 2. Underframing your authority. Some people frame themselves as lower status participants without realizing it. They ask permission for every sentence. "I was wondering if maybe, when you get a chance, you might possibly consider." This isn't politeness. This is framing, and it frames the speaker as uncertain, unsure of their own right to be heard. Directness is not rudeness. It's respect for the listener's time and for your own ideas. Mistake 3. Skipping expectation setting. People become defensive when they don't know what to expect. If you say, "We should talk about the budget," without context, the listener's brain fills in the gap with their worst fear. But if you say, "I want to walk you through some ideas I have for reallocating budget in a way I think will actually free up resources for the team," you've given the brain a safe place to land. Expectation setting is a form of framing that drops resistance before it even rises. Advanced framing tools. The future frame. When you want someone to commit to a course of action, anchor the conversation in the future outcome rather than the present problem. Imagine where this could take the team 6 months from now if we get this right. Is far more motivating than, "Here's what we need to fix right now." Future frames bypass resistance by speaking to aspiration. The benefit frame. Connect your message directly to what the listener values. Here's why this matters specifically for you. And then actually say something that is specifically relevant to them, not just generically good. The clarity frame. This one is underrated. When conversations are going sideways because of misunderstanding, a clarity frame resets everything. Let me be precise about what I'm saying and equally clear about what I'm not saying. This stops assumptions from hijacking the exchange. The alignment frame, particularly powerful in persuasion and negotiation. Here's what you want. Here's what I want. Here's how both of those things can happen. When people feel aligned, the brain's threat detection system stands down. Alignment feels like safety, and safety is the prerequisite for cooperation. Reframing, the skill of recovering mid-conversation. What happens when the conversation has already slid into a bad frame? You reframe, not by denying the tension, but by redirecting it. Instead of, "You're not listening to me," try, "I want to make sure we both feel heard here." Instead of, "You're wrong," try, "There's an angle on this I don't think we've fully explored yet. Can I share it?" Instead of, "That's not what I said," try, "Let me clarify, because I think something got lost in translation." Each of these reframes does the same thing. It removes the adversarial charge from the exchange without abandoning the substance. The conversation goes from two people fighting to two people solving. And in that shift, everything becomes possible, framing, and trust. There's one more dimension worth exploring here, and it's particularly powerful. When you lead with transparency, explaining not just what you're saying but why you're bringing it up, trust increases dramatically. The reason I'm raising this now is because I want to get ahead of it before it becomes a bigger issue. That sentence reduces uncertainty. And uncertainty, as we'll explore throughout this book, is one of the primary enemies of communication. When the listener doesn't know your motive, they guess. And they rarely guess generously. A transparent frame fills in that blank so the imagination doesn't fill it with something worse. The person who sets the frame controls the game. Here's the bottom line on framing. Most people walk into conversations and react to whatever frame is already present. They let the emotional weather of the room dictate how they show up. Powerful communicators arrive with a frame ready. They've thought, even briefly, about how they want this conversation to feel, what outcome they're guiding toward, and what psychological environment needs to exist for that outcome to be possible. This doesn't require manipulation. It requires intention. The frame decides the game. And the person who sets the frame thoughtfully, ethically, and early rarely loses the game. Chapter HREE. Understand human biases and assumption gaps. Every message you send travels through a filter before it reaches the listener. That filter is built from their history, their fears, their experiences, their identity, and their current emotional state. No message arrives clean. Every message is processed through the lens of the person receiving it. This is not a bug in human communication. It's a feature. The brain uses these filters, these cognitive shortcuts, to process an overwhelming world quickly and efficiently. But those same shortcuts that help us move fast also distort what we hear. To be a truly powerful communicator, you need to understand the filters that shape how your words are received. Confirmation bias, the filter that hears what it expects. Confirmation bias is the brain's tendency to seek, notice, and remember information that confirms what it already believes, and to dismiss or minimize information that contradicts it. In practice, if someone already thinks you don't respect their work, they will interpret almost anything you say through that lens. A neutral comment becomes a slight. A minor correction becomes proof of their suspicion. Your actual intention becomes irrelevant because their filter has already classified the message. This is why rebuilding trust is so hard once it's broken. The bias creates a self-reinforcing loop. The person expects disrespect. They interpret ambiguous signals as disrespectful. Their expectation as confirmed. The loop continues. The communicator's job is to be aware of what filter the listener might be running and to communicate in a way that actively disrupts the loop. Explicitness helps here. If you know someone thinks you dismiss their ideas, start by acknowledging their ideas with genuine specificity, not as a technique, as a reality check that the filter is wrong. Negativity bias. Bad news travels louder. Here's a finding from psychology that should change how you give feedback forever. Humans are wired to pay approximately 5 times more attention to negative information than to positive information. This is called negativity bias, and it's an evolutionary inheritance. Our ancestors who were hypervigilant about threats The rustle in the bushes, the tension in someone's face, survived longer than those who were blissfully optimistic. But that ancient alarm system creates a modern problem. If you give someone 3 compliments and 1 piece of critical feedback, they will remember the feedback. If you deliver a presentation with 9 strengths and 1 flaw, the flaw becomes the headline. Negative information is louder, stickier, and more emotionally activating than positive information. For communicators, the implication is significant. If you lead with criticism, the listener's brain goes into protective mode before you've said anything useful. Their capacity to absorb what follows is reduced. Their emotional energy is consumed by defending against the opening. The solution is sequence. Begin with acknowledgement of what is working, not as flattery, but as genuine grounding. Then introduce what can be improved. The negativity bias is still there, but it has less ammunition. And the listener, having felt seen and acknowledged first, has more emotional bandwidth to actually hear the feedback. Ego protection bias, the self-image firewall. Humans have a deep biological need to feel competent, valued, and right. When communication threatens any of those needs, the brain fires a protective response. This is why arguments escalate so predictably. One person says something, the other person hears it as a threat to their competence or their view of themselves. They defend, not the position, but the identity. The first person, now also feeling attacked, defends their identity. And suddenly 2 people who may have started an agreement are in full battle mode, fighting for something they both care about, their sense of self. Understanding ego protection doesn't mean you coddle people or avoid hard truths. It means you deliver hard truths in a way that doesn't trigger the firewall. The difference between you keep making this mistake, and here's something that I think, if we address it, would make a real difference, is not about the content. It's about whether the listener's ego feels under attack. The first sentence triggers the firewall. The second sentence keeps it down. People learn better, cooperate better, and change faster when they don't feel like they're losing status in the process. Assumption gaps. The story the mind fills in. Here's a scenario. You send a colleague a message. Can we find time to connect today? I have something I need to discuss. Benign, right? Maybe. But watch what that colleague's brain does with it. If they recently made a mistake they're worried about, their brain fills in, I'm in trouble. If there's been tension in the team, their brain fills in, this is about the conflict. If they're insecure about their performance, their brain fills in, they're unhappy with my work. You said 11 words. Their brain wrote a short story. This is the assumption gap, the space between what you said and what they heard, filled automatically and unconsciously by their existing narrative. The more emotional history there is in a relationship, the wider this gap tends to be. And the wider the gap, the greater the potential for misunderstanding. The most effective way to close assumption gaps is radical specificity. Don't say, I need to discuss something. Say, I want to get your input on the project timeline before the end of day. The specific content removes the vacuum that anxiety fills. Simple bridging phrases also help. The reason I'm bringing this up is, or, I want to be transparent about what I'm trying to accomplish here. These phrases preemptively answer the question the listener's brain is quietly asking. What are their motives? What does this mean about me? The central principle: communication quality increases when interpretation effort decreases. Here's the master insight from all of this. The more the listener has to guess, infer, or decode, the more vulnerable your message is to bias, assumption, and distortion. Every gap you leave open is a gap their imagination fills, and not always in your favor. The less they have to guess, the cleaner the communication. This doesn't mean over-explaining or treating people like they're incapable. It means being precise where precision prevents misinterpretation. It means bridging where bridging reduces uncertainty. It means checking in. Does that land the way I intended? Because the message you sent and the message they received are almost never identical. Great communicators don't wait for misunderstandings to happen and then try to fix them. They prevent them. And that prevention begins with understanding the extraordinary complexity of the machine that receives your words. The human brain, in all its biased, assumption-filled, ego-protecting glory. When you honor that complexity, your communication becomes not just clearer, but kinder, smarter, and immeasurably more powerful. Chapter FOUR. Communicate with emotional precision. Let's talk about the hidden layer of every conversation you've ever had. Every message carries 2 things simultaneously: the information on the surface and the emotion underneath. And here's the crucial insight. People don't primarily respond to the information. They respond to the emotion. You've experienced this. You've had conversations where the facts were perfectly clear, the logic was airtight, and still, the other person walked away with a completely different interpretation than you intended. Why? Because the emotional layer of your communication sent a different message than the words did. Think about a simple phrase. That's interesting. Said with warmth and genuine curiosity, it's an invitation. Said with a flat tone and distracted eyes, it's a dismissal. Said with a slight edge, it might even sound like sarcasm. The words are identical. The emotional subtext changes everything. Emotional precision is the ability to communicate not just what you mean, but what you feel, with enough intentionality that the listener receives both layers accurately and coherently. Emotional awareness, seeing the invisible. The first barrier to emotional precision is that most people don't notice what they're feeling when they're in the middle of communicating it. You might sit down for a difficult conversation while carrying anxiety from an entirely unrelated situation, a stressful commute, a frustrating email, an unresolved argument from the night before. And without realizing it, that emotional residue colors everything you say: your tone, your pace, your face, your body. The listener doesn't know about the commute or the email. They just experience the version of you that walked through the door. And if that version is tense or distracted, they attribute it to the conversation itself. This is why emotional self-check is a professional-level communication skill. Before any significant conversation, whether it's a presentation, a difficult discussion, or even an important phone call, pause. Internally ask, what am I carrying right now? What emotional state am I in? And then ask, is this the emotional state I want to bring into this conversation? The neuroscience behind this practice is compelling. Dr. Antonio Damasio's research at USC shows that emotion and decision-making are deeply intertwined, so much so that people with damage to emotional processing centers of the brain become paradoxically terrible at making decisions, even when their pure logic remains intact. Emotion is not the enemy of good thinking. It's an essential component. The problem isn't feeling emotions. The problem is being driven by them unconsciously. Naming the emotion, "I'm feeling irritated right now," doesn't just describe your state, it measurably changes it. UCLA neuropsychologist Matthew Lieberman found that labeling emotions activates the prefrontal cortex and simultaneously reduces amygdala activity. In plain language, naming what you feel gives you back control of your thinking, reading the emotional landscape of the listener. The second dimension of emotional precision is reading and responding to the emotional state of the person you're communicating with. This requires a skill that goes beyond listening to words. It requires listening to signals. People rarely say exactly what they're feeling. More often, they signal it. A quick nod might not mean agreement. It might mean, "I want this conversation to end." A monosyllabic answer might not mean disinterest. It might mean emotional shutdown. Crossed arms might not mean defensiveness. They might simply mean the person is cold or concentrating. Context matters. But here's the key principle. When emotional cues and verbal content are in conflict, trust the emotional cues. If someone says, "I'm fine with that," but their voice is flat, their shoulders are tight, and they've stopped making eye contact, they are not fine with that. And if you proceed as though they are, you will learn later, often at the worst possible moment, that the real conversation was never had. The skilled response to emotional incongruence is to gently name what you're observing, not to diagnose it. Something like, "You seem a bit hesitant. Is there something about this that we haven't fully addressed?" You're not telling them what they feel. You're creating space for them to tell you, and that space, that's where real communication happens. The emotional texture of tone. Your tone is the delivery vehicle for your emotion, and tone is not decoration. Tone is meaning. Consider the classic example of "we need to talk." Depending entirely on tone, that phrase can communicate a sense of caring urgency, cold anger, professional seriousness, or existential threat. The words are neutral. The tone carries all the emotional information. This creates a profound responsibility. Because tone is often unconscious, it can carry emotions you didn't intend to send, and the listener has no way to distinguish between emotions you meant and emotions that leaked out. The practice of deliberate tone is simple in concept and requires real discipline in practice. Before you speak, especially in high-stakes moments, consciously select the emotional register you want to communicate in. Do you want this to feel warm, calm, firm, encouraging, honest but gentle? Choose, and then speak from that choice. Actors train for years to control emotional delivery. You don't need actor-level skill. You just need actor-level awareness. Empathy, not agreement but understanding. A critical clarification. Empathy in communication does not mean agreeing with someone's perspective. It means demonstrating that you understand it. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is the source of enormous misunderstanding about what empathy actually requires. You can say, "I understand why that felt unfair to you," without agreeing that it was unfair. You can say, "I can see why that situation was stressful," without agreeing that the person handled it well. You're acknowledging the emotional reality of their experience, not endorsing their interpretation of events. This matters because acknowledgement is what disarms defensiveness. When someone feels genuinely understood, not managed, not patronized, but actually seen, their nervous system relaxes, the tension in the conversation drops. And from that point of reduced tension, rational discussion becomes possible in a way it wasn't before. The psychologist Carl Rogers called this unconditional positive regard, the practice of communicating to another person that their experience is valid and worth understanding, regardless of whether you agree with them. Rogers demonstrated, across decades of clinical work, that this single practice was the most powerful catalyst for change and cooperation he had ever observed. You don't need to be a therapist to use it. You just need to slow down enough to actually acknowledge what the other person is experiencing, out loud, explicitly, before you say anything else. Emotional precision protects you too. There's a dimension of this that doesn't get talked about enough. Emotional precision isn't just about how you affect others. It also protects you from the common ways that unmanaged emotion distorts your own communication. When guilt drives your words, you over-explain and over-justify, burying your point under so many apologies and qualifications that no one can find it. When insecurity drives your words, you soften your message until it has no edge left, and then wonder why nobody takes you seriously. When anger drives your words, you push too hard, too fast, and burn bridges you'll need later. Emotional precision keeps you grounded. It allows you to hold confidence without aggression, firmness without cruelty, vulnerability without instability, care without losing your own center. It's the difference between speaking from your emotions and speaking about your emotions, with your emotions as context rather than control. And when you master that distinction, your communication becomes something extraordinary. Not perfect, not robotic, but aligned. And alignment, as we'll see again and again throughout this book, is where all real communication power lives. Chapter 5. Speak clearly, not cleverly. Here's a trap that catches brilliant people more reliably than anyone else. The trap of trying to sound intelligent rather than trying to be understood. It makes intuitive sense why smart people fall into it. If you've spent years accumulating knowledge, developing complex frameworks, learning sophisticated vocabulary, it feels natural to demonstrate that sophistication when you speak. The elaborate sentence construction, the technical language, the layered argument that shows all the dimensions you've considered. It feels thorough. It feels credible. It feels intelligent. What it actually does is lose people. There's a fascinating study from NYU showing that using needlessly complex language actually makes you sound less intelligent to most listeners, not more. Because when the listener has to work hard to decode what you're saying, they're using cognitive energy on decoding instead of comprehending. The meaning gets buried under the architecture of the delivery. Clarity, on the other hand, signals mastery. Because to distill something complex into something simple, without losing the truth of it, requires a level of understanding that jargon and complexity cannot demonstrate. Think about Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Feynman was famous for two things: being one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century and being able to explain quantum mechanics to a 10-year-old. He didn't consider these two things to be in tension. He believed they were the same skill. If he couldn't explain something simply, he said, it meant he didn't actually understand it yet. That is the standard. Start with a single point. The most common clarity failure is trying to make too many points simultaneously. A conversation or message that carries 5 ideas usually lands 0 of them. The listener's attention, which is limited, mobile, and constantly competing with a world full of distraction, cannot hold 5 ideas in tension. It grabs 1, maybe 2, and lets the rest drift. So before you speak, ask, what is the one thing I most need this person to understand? Then say that one thing clearly, directly, and first. If you have supporting ideas, they can follow, but the core must be stated explicitly, not implied, not buried, not preceded by 5 minutes of context setting. The journalist's inverted pyramid model is useful here. Lead with the most important information. The additional context supports it. It doesn't precede it. Structure. Give the listener a map. Clarity is also structural. When a conversation jumps between ideas without transitions, starting in the middle, looping back to the beginning, jumping to a conclusion before the context is clear, the listener feels disoriented, like riding a train on a track that keeps changing direction without warning. Structure gives the listener a map. They know where they are, where you're going, and how to orient themselves in relation to what you're saying. A simple structural pattern works for almost any communication. Context, right arrow point, right arrow implication. What's the situation? What am I saying about it? What does that mean? For you, us, the decision at hand. You don't need to label these sections out loud. You just need to move through them in that order, with intention. For more complex communication, presentations, difficult conversations, negotiations, the pattern can expand. What happened, right arrow, what it means, right arrow, what we should do. Again, simple. But simple works. Simple always works. Eliminate verbal clutter. Language clutter is the static that weakens your signal. It sounds like this. I was kind of thinking that maybe if we sort of tried to perhaps look at it from another angle, it might possibly be worth considering. Every hedge, every filler, every basically, every every sort of. These aren't just stylistic weaknesses. They're communicative leaks. They signal uncertainty even when you feel none. They train your listener to subconsciously hear you as less authoritative, less clear, less trustworthy. The solution isn't to become cold or stiff, it's to replace verbal clutter with confident directness, and to use pauses, actual silence, instead of filler sounds. A pause says, I'm thinking before I speak, because what I say matters. And says, I haven't finished thinking yet and I'm filling the air so you don't interrupt me. One of these commands attention. The other invites it to drift. Directness is respect. Many people soften their communication to the point of obscuring it because they're afraid that being direct will seem aggressive or unkind. This is a false choice. Directness and kindness are not opposites. Directness is actually a profound form of respect. It respects the listener's time. It respects their intelligence, trusting them to receive a clear message without needing it wrapped in 12 layers of cushioning. It respects your own ideas by giving them the clean delivery they deserve. Compare these two sentences. I was thinking that, if you're not too busy at some point, it might be worth maybe looking at possibly restructuring the timeline a bit. I think we need to restructure the timeline. Can we talk about it today? The first sentence makes the listener do all the work. They have to extract the meaning from the hedge. The second sentence is the meaning. It's the same idea. One respects the listener. One hides from them, adjusts for context and audience. Clarity is not a universal setting. It's calibrated to the person in front of you. A domain expert can absorb more technical density. A generalist needs more contextual scaffolding. Someone who processes visually responds better to concrete images and examples. Someone who processes analytically might want the data first. Someone in an emotional state might need the emotional layer addressed before they can absorb any logical content at all. Adaptive clarity, matching your level of detail, your vocabulary, your structure to the specific person in this specific moment, is one of the highest level communication skills. And it starts with paying attention, not to what you want to say, but to what they're ready to receive. Because ultimately, clarity is not about you. It is a gift you give the listener. Cleverness serves your ego. Clarity serves your purpose. And when you consistently serve the purpose, when people finish listening to you and think, I know exactly what that meant, and I know exactly what to do about it, you stop being someone who talks. You become someone who communicates. Chapter SIX, Stop Talking First. Influence Through Listening. Here is one of the most counterintuitive insights in this entire book. The most powerful thing you can do to become a better communicator is to talk less. We think of communication as an output skill. Speaking, presenting, persuading, explaining. We train for it as if it were a performance. But the communicators who actually move people, who build deep trust, who consistently get what they need from conversations, they've learned something that changes everything. Influence begins with your ears, not your mouth. And that's not just a feel-good principle. It's backed by hard psychology. When you listen to someone, really listen, not just wait for your turn. Several things happen simultaneously. The speaker reveals information you could never have guessed. They tell you, through word choice and emphasis and hesitation, exactly what they value, what they fear, what they need to hear. They give you the blueprint for how to communicate with them. And they also, paradoxically, become more open to being influenced by you because they feel understood. And people cooperate with those who understand them. The psychology of being heard. There's a phenomenon in psychology called the feeling heard effect. When people feel genuinely listened to, their defensive barriers lower. Their emotional guardedness relaxes. Their openness to new information, including information that might challenge their existing views, increases. Dr. John Gottman, the researcher who spent decades studying what makes relationships succeed or fail, found that the single most powerful predictor of relationship health, in marriages, in friendships, in working partnerships, was the quality of listening. Not the absence of conflict, not agreement on values, listening. Because when someone feels heard, they feel respected. And when they feel respected, they stop spending energy on defense, and they start spending it on connection. This is influence, not persuasion as pushing, but persuasion as opening. What listening actually requires. Real listening is not what most people do. Most people, when someone else is talking, are doing one of four things: mentally rehearsing their response, waiting for a pause to redirect to their own point, half-heartedly absorbing content while genuinely attending to their phone or their thoughts, or evaluating and judging what's being said against their own framework. None of these is listening. Real listening requires three things: full presence, genuine curiosity, and the discipline to sit in uncertainty without rushing to fill it. Full presence means your body and your mind are both in the room. Not a split-screen version of you where the body nods and the mind is 3 floors up, thinking about something else. Your eyes, your attention, your emotional energy, fully here, fully attending. Genuine curiosity means approaching what someone is saying as genuinely interesting and important, with the assumption that they know something you don't, feel something you haven't felt in that way, see something from an angle you haven't considered. Not performing interest, actually having it. The discipline to sit in uncertainty means resisting the powerful urge to fill every pause, answer every implicit question, fix every expressed problem. It means allowing the speaker to complete their thought, fully, deeply, including the hesitations and revisions and searches for the right words, because those hesitations and searches are often where the most important information lives. The trap of premature advice. Here's a pattern that destroys more conversations than almost anything else. Someone shares a problem, or an experience, or a feeling, and before they've finished, before they've reached the point they were heading toward, before they've felt heard at all, the listener pivots to solutions. Have you tried? What you should do is, the same thing happened to me, and what I found was. The intention is kindness, the effect is dismissal. Because people don't always speak to be fixed, they often speak to be heard first. And when you rush to solve before you've completed the act of listening, the speaker doesn't feel helped, they feel redirected. Their experience, before it's been fully honored, has already been turned into a platform for your expertise. Advice should follow understanding, not precede it. A simple rule: wait until someone explicitly asks for your input before you offer it. Or, if you sense they want guidance but haven't asked, gently check. Would it help if I shared what I've seen work in situations like this? That one question transforms the dynamic from lecture to conversation. The power of strategic silence. One of the most advanced listening tools is the deliberate use of silence after someone speaks. When someone says something and you pause, genuinely pause, not just hesitate. Before responding, several things happen. The speaker often elaborates, moving from surface explanation to deeper truth. They reflect on what they just said, and sometimes revise it to something more accurate. And they experience you as someone who is genuinely processing what they said, not just waiting to rebut it. In negotiation, this is well documented. The side that is more comfortable with silence routinely extracts more information, more concessions, and more creative solutions from the other side, simply because the other side rushes to fill the silence by offering more than they initially planned. In personal conversation, the effect is intimacy. The pause says, "What you said mattered enough for me to think about it before I respond." That is a profound gift. Most people have never experienced it. When they do, they trust you in a way that is hard to explain and almost impossible to undo. Listening builds the blueprint for influence. Here's the strategic dimension that ties everything together. Before you try to persuade someone, you need to understand how their mind works. What do they value? What are they afraid of? What story are they telling themselves about the situation? What do they need to feel before they can consider something new? You cannot know any of this without listening. And once you know it, persuasion stops being guesswork. You're not throwing arguments against a wall and hoping one sticks. You're speaking directly to their internal language, their values, their fears, their existing narrative, in a way that invites them to move, rather than pushing them. The brilliant communicator who speaks first and often misses all of this. They give a generic argument. They make a generic appeal. They wonder why people don't respond. The person who listens first, who gathers, who observes, who understands, then speaks with devastating precision. Every word lands because it was aimed by intelligence, not impulse. The formula is simple. Collect first, deliver second, and the delivery becomes 10 times more powerful. Chapter SEVEN. Ask questions that open people up. If listening is the most underrated skill in communication, then asking questions is the most underused tool. The right question, asked at the right moment, can do more to advance a conversation than 30 minutes of explanation. It can disarm conflict that 100 logical arguments would only intensify. It can build intimacy faster than a dozen shared experiences. It can reveal information that no amount of direct inquiry would ever surface. Questions are invitation. They say, "Your mind matters here. Your perspective is part of this. I'm not just broadcasting. I'm genuinely interested in what comes back." And in a world saturated with broadcasting, with opinions, with advice, with takes, with unsolicited wisdom, the person who genuinely wants to know what you think becomes extraordinarily rare and therefore extraordinarily magnetic. Open questions versus closed questions. There's a fundamental distinction that determines whether your questions open conversations or close them. Closed questions produce data. Did you finish the report? Gives you a yes or no, useful for logistics, useless for understanding. Open questions produce meaning. What felt most challenging about putting that report together? Produces insight, context, and relationship. It invites the other person to reveal how they think, what they prioritize, where they struggle. For most of the conversations that actually matter, the ones about alignment, understanding, trust, decision-making, conflict resolution, open questions are the tool. Some of the most powerful open questions in communication. What matters most to you about this? Reveals values. What are you most concerned about? Reveals fears and risk perception. How did you come to see it that way? Reveals reasoning and history. What would a good outcome look like for you? Reveals their success criteria. What haven't we talked about yet that feels important? Opens the space for what hasn't been said. Each of these questions is an instrument. They're not just polite curiosity, they're strategic invitations for the other person to show you their inner world. And their inner world is where the real conversation lives. Questions as mirrors. Here's something remarkable about the right question. It doesn't just give you information. It gives the person answering it something equally valuable. Clarity about themselves. What would success actually look like for you? Seems like a simple question, but many people have never stopped to precisely articulate their answer. When they do, out loud in response to your question, they often discover things about themselves they hadn't consciously formulated. They hear themselves say something and think, "Oh, that's what I actually want." You've just given them a mirror, and people trust those who help them see themselves, without judgment, without interruption, without agenda. This is why great coaches, great therapists, and great leaders share one behavior. They ask extraordinary questions, not because they don't have answers, but because they understand that the answer someone discovers themselves is infinitely more powerful than the answer someone tells them. Questions in persuasion. Guide, don't push. This is one of the most powerful applications of questioning. Direct argument can trigger ego protection. When you tell someone what to think, their defensiveness rises proportionally to the strength of your argument, because strong arguments feel like attacks on their current position, and their ego mobilizes to defend that position. But when you ask questions that guide someone to discover the same conclusion on their own, that's a different experience entirely. There's no attack. There's no defense. There's just discovery. The Socratic method, guiding people to insight through questions rather than declarations, has been recognized as one of the most effective educational and persuasive tools in human history for a reason. It doesn't just deliver information, it creates ownership, and people fight for what they own. What do you think would happen if we approached it this way? Is more powerful than we should approach it this way. The first invites participation. The second demands agreement. Sequencing, building safety before depth. Questions are not all equal in their emotional weight. And part of the art of asking questions is knowing the order. Starting with the deepest question in a conversation is like skipping the warm-up before a sprint. You'll get resistance or injury. Emotional depth requires emotional safety. And safety is built gradually. Begin with lighter questions that orient the conversation, establish common ground, and signal your genuine interest. How did you come to be working on this project? Before, what's the biggest challenge you're facing in your career right now? Let safety build, then move deeper. The deeper questions, the ones that reveal real fears, real values, real needs, will only be answered honestly when the person feels safe enough to be honest. And that safety is created, question by question, in the earlier part of the exchange. This is sequencing. It's the art of building a conversation from the outside in, starting wide and safe, moving gradually toward the meaningful and specific. Like tuning an instrument before you play it, questions protect against your own assumptions. There's a personal benefit to asking questions that's easy to overlook. Every assumption you make about someone, their motivations, their meaning, their emotional state, is a guess. And guesses, when wrong, create misunderstanding that can be extremely expensive to repair. "What did you mean when you said that?" is a sentence that has prevented more unnecessary arguments than perhaps any other in human communication. Because often, the interpretation that triggered your reaction was not the intended meaning. Often, what felt like a slight was carelessness. What felt like criticism was curiosity. What felt like dismissal was distraction. Checking rather than assuming is a form of intellectual humility. It says, "I'm not so certain about my interpretation that I'm willing to act on it without verification." That humility, in communication, is not a weakness. It's a safeguard. It's the difference between starting a conversation and starting a fight. Ask first, assume less, and watch what opens. Chapter EIGA, Master Body Language, Tone, and presence. Long before a single word lands, something else has already communicated volumes: the way you enter a room, the set of your shoulders, the quality of your eye contact, the pace at which you breathe, the steadiness or shakiness of your voice. These things speak before you do, and they continue speaking throughout every word you say. Research by Albert Mehrabian, often cited in communication circles, suggested that the emotional impact of a message comes roughly 55% from body language, 38% from tone, and only 7% from the actual words. These specific numbers are debated. The study had a narrow scope, but the underlying principle is robust and widely confirmed by subsequent research. Nonverbal communication carries enormous weight, sometimes more weight than the words themselves. The reason is evolutionary. Long before humans developed complex language, we were reading bodies, faces, and sounds for threat detection, social status, and group belonging. Those systems still operate in us, below consciousness, continuously. They're running in every conversation you have, on your end and on the listener's. Which means the question is not whether body language communicates. It always does. The question is whether you're communicating what you intend. Posture, the architecture of confidence. Posture is the most immediately visible nonverbal signal, and people form impressions from it faster than they can consciously process what they're seeing. Harvard Business School professor Amy Cuddy's research on body language showed that expansive postures, taking up space, standing tall, open chest, not only communicate confidence to observers, they actually measurably change the communicator's own hormonal state. High-power postures were associated with increased testosterone, associated with confidence, and decreased cortisol, associated with stress in study participants. Your posture, in other words, doesn't just affect how others perceive you, it affects how you feel, which then affects how you speak, which completes the loop. Straight but relaxed posture signals confidence without aggression. Leaning slightly forward signals engaged interest. Crossed arms, slouched shoulders, constant fidgeting, these signal either discomfort, defensiveness, or disengagement, regardless of your actual intention. And once that signal is sent, it's extremely difficult to override with words alone. Eye contact, the connection signal. Eye contact is one of the most nuanced nonverbal tools. Too little and you appear evasive, unsure, or disinterested. Too much, unblinking, unvarying, and you appear aggressive or intimidating. The goal is steady, natural, comfortable eye contact, the kind that communicates, I see you, I'm here, you have my attention. In group settings, move your eye contact from person to person as you speak, pausing briefly with each individual so they feel specifically included, not just part of an audience. In one-on-one conversations, particularly difficult or emotionally charged ones, eye contact becomes even more important. It signals that you're not hiding. It signals honesty. And because we're wired to read the eyes for emotional truth, think about how quickly you can tell when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes. Genuine, warm eye contact during hard conversations does more to build trust than almost any verbal assurance. Vocal tone, the carrier wave of meaning. If words are the content, tone is the carrier wave, and the carrier wave determines how the content is received far more than the content itself. Here's the practical reality. You can say, "That's a good idea," in a way that genuinely means it, or in a way that clearly doesn't. The words are identical. The listener knows the difference, not because they analyzed your tone analytically, but because they felt it. Tone control is a learnable skill. It begins with emotional awareness, which we covered in Chapter 4. Because your emotional state directly generates your tone. The more conscious you are of what you're feeling, the more deliberate you can be about the tone you're delivering. But there are also specific mechanical dimensions of tone worth mastering. Pace. Fast speech signals excitement, urgency, or nervousness, depending on context. Slow speech signals authority, thoughtfulness, or gravity. The most powerful communicators vary their pace deliberately, slowing to emphasize, quickening to build energy, pausing to allow impact. Volume. Appropriate volume for context matters enormously. Speaking too softly in professional settings reads as uncertainty. Speaking too loudly reads as aggression. But subtle strategic variations, lowering your volume slightly as you reach your most important point, actually draw people in rather than pushing them away. The instinct to get louder to be heard is often backwards. Inflection. Upward inflection at the end of statements makes them sound like questions, which signals uncertainty. Flat downward ending inflection on a declarative statement signals conviction. Listen to leaders and speakers you find genuinely authoritative, and you'll notice their assertions end on solid ground. The power of the pause. Nothing underscores a point like silence. This is counterintuitive for most people, because most people fear silence. They interpret it as dead air, as awkwardness, as losing control of the conversation. So they fill it with the next sentence before the previous one has even landed. But pause is punctuation. It marks the end of a thought and signals that what was just said was worth stopping for. It gives the listener's brain the space to absorb, process, and feel the weight of what was communicated. Without that space, important ideas become part of an undifferentiated stream. Watch the most effective communicators, keynote speakers, skilled interviewers, compelling leaders, and you'll notice they're not afraid of silence. They weaponize it. They make a key point, and then they stop. They let the room sit with it. And in that sitting, the point goes deeper than any repetition would take it. Practice the pause. After your most important sentences, stop. Don't rush to the next thought. Let what you said breathe. The discomfort you feel in that pause is far shorter and far less significant than the impact it creates. Presence. The energy behind all of it. Beyond specific techniques, beyond posture, eye contact, tone, pause, there is something that all of these techniques, practiced well, converge toward. Something that can't be faked and can be felt from across a room. Presence. Presence is not charisma. It's not the performance of confidence or the theatrical display of authority. Presence is the quality of being genuinely, fully here. It's the absence of internal scatter, the distracted mind, the half-attention. The one foot out the door quality that people sense and respond to with a withdrawal of their own when someone is fully present with you, when their attention is completely on you, not partially somewhere else. It's a rare and powerful experience. Most people rarely encounter it. It creates an immediate sense that you matter, that this conversation matters, that what you say will actually be received. And because it's so rare, it's also extraordinarily memorable. You don't just remember what a fully present person said to you. You remember how it felt to be truly listened to by them. Presence is built through practice. It requires training your attention the way you'd train a muscle, pulling it back when it wanders, insisting on the now, finding the genuine point of interest in the person in front of you rather than in the thoughts competing for space in your head. The more present you become, the more your body language, tone, and words align naturally, because they're all coming from the same source. And that alignment is what people experience as integrity, the sense that what you're communicating on the outside matches what you are on the inside. Alignment. When everything speaks the same language. The clearest test of nonverbal mastery is this: is everything pointing in the same direction? Words, tone, face, posture. When these align, communication feels coherent, trustworthy, and real. When they diverge, when the words say, "I am committed to this," but the face says boredom and the posture says disengagement, people feel the dissonance. They may not be able to articulate it, but they feel it, and they trust the nonverbal signal over the verbal one every time. This is why alignment isn't just an aesthetic virtue. It's the structural requirement of credibility. You cannot have people trust your words if your body is telling a different story. Alignment requires internal honesty. If you don't believe what you're saying, your body will say so. If you're not emotionally committed to the outcome you're describing, that gap will be visible. The solution isn't better acting. It's better alignment between what you say and what you actually think and feel, which sometimes means being willing to speak a harder, more honest truth rather than a convenient, unconvincing one. Chapter NINE tells stories that make people feel and act. Here's something worth sitting with. Data is forgotten. Stories are remembered, not as a preference, as a neurological fact. When Uri Hasson and his colleagues at Princeton University scanned the brains of people listening to stories, they found something remarkable. The brains of the listeners didn't just passively receive the information. They began to synchronize with the brain of the storyteller. The same regions lit up in both brains. The story was not just being heard, it was being felt, shared, co-created in real time. This phenomenon, called neural coupling, explains why a well-told story can move a room full of strangers to tears, while a perfectly logical argument leaves them unmoved. The story doesn't just inform the mind, it inhabits it. And that inhabitation is where real change happens. Why your brain is a story machine. The human brain is not designed to remember lists, statistics, or abstract principles. It's designed to remember narrative. Think back over your life and identify the moments that genuinely changed how you think about something. The insights that stuck. The lessons that rewired something. Almost certainly, they came through experience or story, not through a fact you were told or a slide deck you were shown. This is because memory is emotionally indexed. We remember what we felt, and feelings are generated by narrative, by character, by struggle, by resolution, by meaning. This has enormous implications for anyone who wants to communicate with influence. When you tell a story instead of making a point, you're not just delivering information more palatably, you're activating the listener's brain in a fundamentally different way, engaging their imagination, their empathy, their pattern recognition, their emotional system. You're creating an experience rather than transmitting data. And experiences change people. Data updates their spreadsheets. The structure of a story that works. Storytelling doesn't require dramatic talent, literary flair, or a theatrical voice. It requires structure. And structure can be learned in minutes. Most effective stories follow a simple 4-part arc. Situation. Set the context. Where are we? Who's involved? What's happening? Keep this part brief. The brain needs orientation, not essay. Struggle. Introduce tension. Something went wrong. Something was difficult. Something was at stake. Without struggle, there's no story, just description. The struggle is what generates engagement. It's the moment the listener's brain asks, what happens next? Resolution. How did the situation change? What action was taken? What decision was made? What shifted? Lesson. What does this mean? Why does it matter here now in this conversation? The lesson is what separates a story from a memory. A memory is just an account of something that happened. A lesson is wisdom, something the listener can carry forward and use. Without the lesson, you've entertained. With the lesson, you've taught. Small stories, large impact. A common misconception about storytelling is that the stories have to be grand, dramatic reversals of fortune, life or death stakes, extraordinary moments. They don't. Some of the most powerful stories in communication are small, quiet, and specific. A brief exchange with a stranger that contained an unexpected insight. A childhood memory of someone modeling a quality you came to value. A moment in a meeting where one sentence changed the direction of an entire project. What makes a story powerful is not the scale of the event, it's the clarity and resonance of the lesson. A story about a major failure can be boring if the lesson is vague. A story about finding a penny can be profound if the lesson is precise and universal. The question to ask before any story is, what is the single thing I want this story to prove or illuminate? Start from the lesson and work backwards to find the story that carries it, not the other way around. Emotion is the engine. Stories without emotion are just reports. The emotion doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't need tears or laughter, though those aren't wrong. What it needs is honesty, a genuine feeling embedded in the telling that the listener can pick up and resonate with. When you share a story about a time you were genuinely uncertain, the listener feels the uncertainty. When you share a story about a moment of unexpected clarity, they feel the clarity. When you share a story about the cost of ignoring something important, they feel the weight of that. This is neural coupling in action. Your emotion, transmitted through the story, activates parallel emotion in the listener. And that shared emotional experience is the foundation of the one thing that actually drives behavior. Motivation. People don't act because they know something. They act because they feel something. Stories are the most reliable delivery mechanism for that feeling. Humanizing through story. There's a relational dimension of storytelling that often goes unmentioned. When you tell a story, especially one that involves your own uncertainty, your own mistakes, your own learning, you make yourself human, not perfect. Not an authority broadcasting from on high. Human, fallible, real, and realness is what creates connection. We trust people who feel human to us. We trust people who have learned things through experience, not just through study. We're suspicious of perfection because we know it's performed. We're drawn to honesty because it's rare. A leader who only gives instructions creates compliance. A leader who shares the story of why those instructions matter, including the struggle that made them necessary, creates understanding. And understanding, as we've said before, is what people follow willingly rather than just obediently. Storytelling and persuasion. Stories bypass the ego's defenses in a way that logical argument rarely does. When you tell someone a fact and they disagree with it, they argue. When you tell someone a story that illustrates the same fact, they experience it, and the experience doesn't feel like an argument. There's no one to argue with. There's just a narrative unfolding. The listener draws the conclusion themselves. They see the person in the story making a choice and experiencing a consequence, and they connect the dots. And when they connect the dots themselves, the conclusion belongs to them. It's not your argument that you're pushing on them. It's their own insight, which they've just discovered. Ownership of insight kills resistance. This is why great salespeople don't tell you why you should buy something. They tell you a story about someone whose life changed when they had it, and they let your imagination do the rest. When your communication uses story to guide people to voluntary insight, you're not manipulating. You're respecting the psychology of how humans actually change through experience, not through being told. Chapter TEN. Persuade without forcing or manipulating. Let's start with a clarification that changes everything. Persuasion, done right, is not about winning. It is not about defeating the other person's position with the force of your argument. It is not about being clever enough to trick someone into agreeing. Real persuasion has nothing in common with any of those things. Real persuasion is alignment. It's the art of finding and clearly illuminating the path where both of you get what you genuinely need. And here's the paradox. Persuasion that feels like persuasion usually fails. When someone feels pushed, their instinct is to push back. When someone feels manipulated, they disengage. When someone feels cornered, they escape or fight. The very effort to overtly convince someone activates their resistance, but persuasion that feels like understanding, like being genuinely seen, like someone is helping them get what they want, succeeds. Every time, intent is the foundation. Before we talk about technique, we need to talk about intent. Because technique without the right intent is manipulation. And manipulation, while sometimes effective in the short term, destroys trust, which is the only platform on which real influence is built. If your goal in persuasion is mutual benefit, if you're genuinely trying to help the other person see a path that serves them as well as you, then every technique in this chapter is ethical. If your goal is to extract something from someone while giving them nothing real in return, then no technique in this chapter will build lasting influence. Robert Cialdini, who wrote the foundational text on influence, spent decades studying what makes persuasion work, not in lab settings but in real life, with people actually making decisions. His conclusion, across all his research, was that sustainable influence is built on genuine alignment of interests. The shortcuts, manufactured scarcity, false social proof, emotional manipulation, might win a single interaction. They rarely win the relationship, and relationships are where real influence lives. Know what they value. People do not make decisions based on what you value. They make decisions based on what they value. This sounds obvious, but watch how most persuasion attempts work. Someone has a position they want to advance. They enumerate the reasons it's good, the reasons that make sense to them, that align with their own values, their own risk tolerance, their own vision of success. And they're baffled when the other person doesn't respond, because the other person's values might be completely different. If you're trying to persuade someone who values stability and security, and you lead with innovation and disruption, you haven't understood your audience. Not because disruption is wrong, because it's not the language their values speak. The listening skills from Chapter 6 become directly operative here. The more you listen before you persuade, the more you understand what the person values, fears, and needs, the more precisely you can route your message through their internal decision-making system. Persuasion that speaks the listener's values back to them doesn't feel like persuasion. It feels like being understood, and understood people say yes. Alignment, the route around resistance. The most powerful persuasion frame is alignment, not argument, not evidence, though evidence helps when the listener is already open. Alignment. Alignment sounds like, here's what you want. Here's what I want. Here's how both can happen. When people perceive that you're trying to take something from them, time, money, agreement, status, resistance activates. When they perceive that you're trying to help them get more of what they already want, cooperation flows naturally. The shift in framing required here is from, here's why I'm right, to, here's how this helps you. It requires genuine homework. You actually have to understand what helping them looks like. But the payoff is a form of persuasion that doesn't require force, doesn't generate resentment, and doesn't erode the relationship. Reduce the threat to identity. Here's a mechanical insight about why arguments so often escalate beyond what the facts warrant. When someone's position is challenged, they often experience it not just as a challenge to their position, but as a challenge to their identity. If I'm wrong about this, what does that say about me, about my judgment, about my competence? The ego gets involved, and once ego is involved, logic becomes secondary. People will hold positions long past the point where they privately know they're wrong, simply because changing their position would require them to lose face. Skilled persuaders understand this, and they route around it. Instead of, you're wrong about this, which attacks the position and therefore the identity, they say, there's another way to look at this that might be worth considering. Or, I've seen situations like this play out differently under certain conditions. The position is being challenged, but the person isn't. The ego isn't under threat. And without the ego's defensive system engaged, the mind can actually consider new information. Choice preserves autonomy. Humans resist commands, even beneficial ones. Psychological reactance, the tendency to resist when we feel our freedom of choice is being threatened, is one of the most reliably documented phenomena in social psychology. When you feel pushed, you push back. When you feel given options, you explore. So rather than, you need to do X, offer. There are a few ways we could approach this. We could do X or Y, or some combination of both. What feels most viable to you? You haven't sacrificed your goal. You've preserved the listener's sense of agency. And autonomy, the feeling that choices are being made rather than imposed, is one of the most powerful motivators in human behavior. People follow through on choices they made. They drag their feet on instructions they received. Give people choice wherever you can. It's not weakness. It's strategy. Timing, the silent component of persuasion. You can have the most aligned, ego-safe, values-matched argument in the world, and it will still fail if delivered at the wrong moment. When someone is emotionally heightened, angry, frightened, overwhelmed, defensive, they are not in a state where new information can be processed and integrated. The rational processing centers of the brain are outcompeted by the emotional ones. Your brilliant argument will be heard through the filter of their current emotional state, and it will be distorted accordingly. A calm conversation at the right time consistently outperforms a passionate argument at the wrong time. Watch for readiness. When is the person emotionally available? When are they curious rather than defensive? When have they experienced something that makes them open to the perspective you're offering? These windows are sometimes brief, but they're when persuasion actually works. And when those windows don't yet exist, sometimes the most powerful persuasive act is simply to wait. Chapter 11. Build trust and rapport quickly and authentically. Trust is not a precondition for communication. It is the product of it. Every interaction you have either deposits something into the trust account or withdraws from it. A follow-through on a commitment, a deposit. A broken promise, a withdrawal. A moment of genuine, full attention listening, deposit. A distracted, half-present conversation, withdrawal. Most people don't think about trust transactionally. They think of it as a feeling, something that either exists between people or doesn't. But trust is built through accumulated small interactions, most of which go unnoticed precisely because they're small. And it's depleted in the same way. The good news is that trust can be built much faster than most people believe. Not by manufacturing it. Trust can detect inauthenticity from a distance, but by consistently applying the specific behaviors that generate it. Rapport, the gateway state. Before trust, there's rapport. Rapport is the experience of ease, the sense that this person is safe, that conversation flows, that something clicks. It's not necessarily agreement. Two people can completely disagree and still be in high rapport. Rapport is about feel, and feel is determined by very specific, very observable behaviors. The first is presence. We covered this in Chapter 8, but it deserves repetition in this context. Presence communicates. You matter. This conversation matters. I am here. And that communication, when it's genuine, creates an instantaneous shift in how the other person feels. They relax. They become more honest. They become more open. Because most conversations don't offer this. Most conversations are partially attended. The speaker or the listener is simultaneously managing something else, a thought, a concern, a notification, a preoccupation. When someone gives you their full attention, you feel it. And it's remarkable how meaningful it is. The second is mirroring. Human beings naturally synchronize with people they like or feel safe with. We mirror each other's posture, pace, tone, vocabulary, energy. It's not consciously chosen. It happens automatically in positive social interactions. Skilled communicators can use conscious, subtle mirroring to accelerate rapport. If someone speaks slowly and thoughtfully, slow your pace. If someone is animated and energetic, allow your energy to meet theirs. If someone uses a particular phrase or framing, reflect it back naturally. Mirroring, when done subtly and genuinely, sends the brain's social systems a signal. We are similar. This person is safe. That signal reduces defensive alertness and opens the channel for real communication. Validation, the difference between hearing and seeing. Validation is one of the most misunderstood concepts in communication. It doesn't mean agreeing. It means acknowledging that the other person's experience is real to them, that their feelings and perspective from inside their frame of reference make sense. That makes sense, given what you've been through. I can understand why that would be frustrating. From where you stand, I can see why it looks that way. These phrases don't require you to agree with the conclusion. They just require you to honor the human having the experience. And that honoring, that being seen, immediately lowers defensiveness in a way that no argument can. People often become defensive not because they fundamentally disagree, but because they feel their experience isn't being recognized. Once it is recognized, the defensiveness has no fuel. It dissolves. And what's left is a person who is willing to actually engage with what you're saying. Consistency, the currency of trust. Words create expectations. Behavior confirms or destroys them. The fastest way to erode trust is to say one thing and do another. Not dramatically. Most trust isn't broken by dramatic betrayals. It's worn down by small inconsistencies. The follow-up that never came. The commitment that quietly expired. the standard that got applied differently in different contexts. Each of these small inconsistencies is a withdrawal, small enough that the person may not articulate it, but felt enough that it slowly shapes their sense of you. This person's word doesn't quite mean what it appears to. Consistency, in tone, in follow-through, in the values you say matter actually mattering in how you behave, is the compound interest of trust building. It works slowly, it works invisibly, and over time, it becomes one of the most powerful forces in any relationship. Authenticity. The detector is always on. People's social intuition is finely calibrated to detect inauthenticity. We can't always articulate what's wrong, but we feel it. A subtle incongruence, a sense that what's being presented doesn't quite match what's underneath. Think about a time someone gave you a compliment that felt hollow, or apologized in a way that felt perfunctory, or expressed enthusiasm that felt performed. The words were right, something else was off, and you knew. Authenticity in communication doesn't require revealing every private thought or vulnerability. It requires alignment between what you say and what you genuinely believe and feel. It requires that the version of yourself you present in conversation be recognizably the actual you, not a managed performance of a version of you. This is simultaneously easier and harder than it sounds. Easier because authenticity doesn't require work. It requires letting go. Harder because many of us have spent years carefully managing how we appear, particularly in professional contexts, and the habit of performance can run deep. The path to authenticity in communication is the same as in any other domain, gradual. You don't need to transform overnight. You just need to be willing, increasingly, to say what you actually think, to acknowledge what you actually feel, and to let your genuine reactions surface rather than immediately managing them. Humility is a trust tool. There's a counterintuitive truth about credibility. Admitting you don't know something, when you genuinely don't, increases your credibility, not decreases it, because it signals that when you do assert something with confidence, that confidence is real. It signals that you're not performing expertise. You have it, and you know its limits. Saying, "I don't know, but I'll find out," is worth more than a confident-sounding guess that turns out to be wrong, because the wrong guess costs you credibility in proportion to how confident you appeared when you made it. Humility also invites collaboration. When you position yourself as someone who is genuinely curious, rather than someone with all the answers, you create space for others to contribute, and people support what they help build. Their contribution becomes their investment, and investment creates loyalty. Trust grows when judgment disappears. The final trust builder worth examining is perhaps the most powerful and least practiced. When people feel judged, even silently judged, they withhold. They give you the safe, edited version of themselves rather than the real one. They manage your impression of them rather than communicating with you. When people feel genuinely, non-judgmentally curious, when they experience you as someone who is interested without being evaluative, they open. The authentic version comes forward. They tell you what they're actually thinking, what they're actually worried about, what they actually need. This is the version of them you can actually communicate with. The managed version is a wall painted to look like a person. Non-judgment is not the absence of discernment. You can still think clearly about what someone says. You can still disagree. You can still identify problems. But you approach all of that from curiosity rather than condemnation, from interest rather than assessment. And people can tell the difference every time. Chapter 12. Communicate through boundaries and standards. Here's a truth about communication that most people don't discover until they've had a string of exhausting relationships, professional and personal, that left them feeling depleted, resentful, and vaguely disrespected. The problem usually wasn't the relationships. It was the absence of clearly communicated boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They're not ultimatums, not punishments, not withdrawal of affection or cooperation. Boundaries are simply communication, the explicit expression of what you need in order to engage well, sustainably, and with full presence. And without them, communication becomes reactive, chaotic, and eventually corrosive. What boundaries actually protect? The value of a boundary is not about control, it's about preservation. Boundaries protect the specific resources that make genuine communication possible: your attention, your energy, your time, your emotional bandwidth, and your fundamental sense of dignity. When these resources are endlessly available, when there are no clearly stated conditions for how they can be called upon, they get consumed faster than they can be replenished. The result is not just personal burnout, it's communicative deterioration. The quality of your engagement drops. You become reactive instead of responsive. You snap where you once discussed. You withdraw where you once engaged. Resentment is the emotional symptom of depleted resources without protection. And resentment, allowed to accumulate silently, as it usually does, is extraordinarily destructive to relationships. Boundaries prevent resentment from taking root. They're the communication that says, before things break, here's what I need in order to stay fully in this relationship, this conversation, this partnership. How to express boundaries without aggression. This is where most people struggle. They either go too long without stating any limits, letting resentment build until they finally explode, which looks aggressive regardless of intent, or they overcorrect and frame their boundaries as accusations or demands, which triggers defensiveness. The alternative is calm, specific, first-person expression. Compare these. You always call me at the worst times and expect me to drop everything. I'm most available for calls between 2 and 5. If I don't answer outside that window, I'll get back to you within the day. The first is an accusation framed as a boundary. The second is a boundary stated as clear information. The first triggers defensiveness because it attacks the other person's behavior with a judgment. The second provides information that helps the other person navigate the relationship more effectively. Most boundary failures are actually communication failures. Not in the having of limits, but in the expressing of them, too late, too emotionally, or in a way that reads as blame rather than information. Standards, elevating the container. If boundaries protect communication, standards elevate it. A standard is not about what you won't accept. It's about what you expect and invite. Standards create the conditions for your best interactions. Standards sound like, I do my best thinking when we have the information in advance. Can we make that part of how we prepare for these meetings? I find that conversations go better when we're both in a calm state. Can we revisit this when we've both had a chance to process? I appreciate directness. I'd rather you tell me what's actually on your mind, even if it's uncomfortable. Standards, stated early and clearly, prevent the collision of unspoken expectations, which is the source of the majority of professional and personal conflict. When two people are operating from different unstated assumptions about how a relationship should work, the collision is inevitable and often confusing. Neither party may fully understand why the interaction keeps going wrong, because the standard was never communicated, just assumed. Stating standards up front isn't controlling. It's transparent, and transparency, as we've established throughout this book, is one of the foundational conditions of trust. Learning to say no. No is one of the most important words in communication, and one of the most systematically avoided. We avoid it because we conflate no with rejection, or unkindness, or the end of cooperation. But a clear, respectful no is actually the opposite. It's clarity, it's honesty, it's the foundation of an authentic yes. When you say yes to everything, every request, every favor, every demand on your time, your yes becomes meaningless. There's no selectivity, no real commitment behind it, no signal that this particular yes represents genuine prioritization. It's just the absence of no. But when you have established, through the thoughtful, occasional use of clear no, that your yes is earned, it carries weight. It communicates genuine commitment. It signals, I could have said no, and I chose to say yes, which means this matters to me. This is not selfishness. This is the communication of real values, and people around you, in workplaces and in relationships, feel and respond to that realness. Consequences are not threats. When a boundary is repeatedly ignored, the communication has to shift. The tool is the consequence, not punishment, which is reactive and often arbitrary, but consequence, which is simply the natural result that follows when a limit is consistently disregarded. If we can't agree to a consistent agenda, the meetings start running over and the project falls behind. So I'll need to bring this to leadership. Not a threat, a reality. If this conversation continues at this volume, I'm going to step away and we can reconnect when both of us are calmer. Not a punishment. An action that follows from the condition, consequences, stated calmly, give boundaries weight without aggression. They tell the other person, this isn't empty. I mean it. And here's what happens if the pattern continues. Consistent, calm follow-through on stated consequences is what teaches people, gradually, reliably, how to interact with you well, not because you've controlled them, because you've been honest about what the relationship requires. Chapter 13. Handle conflict with calm power. Conflict is not the failure of communication. Conflict is the signal that communication is needed. This reframe matters enormously. When we see conflict as failure, as something that shouldn't be happening, that indicates something is broken, we respond defensively, with urgency and anxiety. We try to make it stop rather than trying to understand what it's telling us. When we see conflict as information, as evidence of a gap in understanding, alignment, or expectation that has not yet been addressed, we can approach it with curiosity. And curiosity, as we've seen throughout this book, changes everything. The anatomy of escalation. Why do conflicts escalate so predictably and so rapidly past what seems proportionate to the original disagreement? Because most conflict stops being about the issue almost immediately. Someone says something. The other person hears it through their filter, their assumption gaps, their ego protection, their negativity bias, and interprets it as a threat. Not necessarily a logical threat, an identity threat. This implies I was wrong. This implies I'm not valued. This implies I'm less than I thought. The ego responds. The defensive wall goes up. Words shorten. Tone sharpens. The other person, feeling the shift, experiences a threat of their own. Their defenses engage. And now two people are in full protective mode, no longer discussing the original issue. They're protecting their self-image from each other. Understanding this anatomy is the first step toward disrupting it. The conflict was never really about the facts. It's about the feelings the facts generated. And feelings, not facts, are where it needs to be addressed. Emotional regulation as strategy. When you're in a conflict, the hardest and most important thing is also the most counterintuitive. Slow down. Every impulse tells you to respond quickly, to defend yourself immediately, to correct the record, to make sure your position is understood before theirs gets established. Speed feels like protection, but speed is actually risk. Fast responses in conflict come from the reactive brain, the system that's good at threat detection and terrible at nuanced communication. The words that come out fastest in conflict are almost never the words you'd choose on reflection. Slowing your physical pace, breathing more slowly, letting a beat pass before you respond, deliberately softening your volume, is not passive. It's a highly active choice to regain access to your full cognitive capacity, to bring the thoughtful brain back online, to choose your words rather than fire them. And here's the strategic bonus. Your calm, in a conflicted interaction, is contagious. When one person de-escalates, the emotional temperature of the exchange typically follows. It's hard to sustain high-intensity conflict against someone who refuses to escalate. The energy has nowhere to go. Language that opens rather than corners. In conflict, the language you use is not incidental. It is causal. Blame language. You always. You never. This is your fault. Places the other person in a corner, and cornered people fight. The content of their response becomes irrelevant. They're fighting their way out of the corner, not engaging with the substance of the issue. Perspective language opens instead of corners. From my side, it felt like, what I experienced was, here's what I was expecting, and here's where the gap appeared. You're sharing your experience rather than indicting their behavior. Same substance, different charge. The shift from you did X to I experienced X when Y happened removes the accusation. It keeps the communication in the first person, where you can speak with authority, rather than the second person, where you're making claims about someone else's intentions that you can't actually verify. This doesn't mean being soft about important things. You can be absolutely clear and firm about what happened and what you need to change, in language that invites discussion rather than triggering defense. Find shared ground before solutions. One of the most counterproductive instincts in conflict is to go directly to solutions. Solutions require alignment, and alignment requires first establishing that both parties are actually trying to get somewhere compatible. Without that, proposed solutions just become new battlegrounds. Before moving to problem solving, find the smallest possible area of genuine agreement. We both want this project to succeed. We both care about how this team functions. We're both frustrated with the same situation. We just have different ideas about why it happened. Even tiny points of shared ground change the emotional physics of a conflict. They remind both parties that they're not enemies. They're people with overlapping interests who have temporarily lost sight of the overlap. From that reminder, cooperation becomes possible. Solutions become jointly owned rather than imposed, and the energy shifts from competition to problem solving. Protecting dignity. Here's a principle that should never be compromised, even in the most heated conflict. The other person's dignity must remain intact. Not because you're being nice, because communication that destroys someone's dignity doesn't actually resolve conflict. It just drives it underground, where it festers and becomes something far harder to address. When someone feels humiliated, when they've lost face in a conflict, the issue no longer matters. The only thing that matters is restoring their sense of self. Everything else, the substance, the solution, the relationship, becomes secondary to the damage control their ego requires. Protecting dignity costs you nothing. Saying, "I respect your perspective, even if I disagree with it," or "That's a fair concern," or "I can see how you arrived there," doesn't concede your position. It honors the humanity of the person you're disagreeing with. And it keeps the conversation a space where actual resolution is possible. Win the argument. Lose the person. That's a trade most people make more often than they realize. The better trade is protect the person, solve the problem together. That's what conflict handled with calm power looks like. Chapter 14. Speak to move people into action. There is a gap that kills more good ideas than any other force in the world, the gap between understanding and action. People can hear your message clearly. They can genuinely agree with it. They can nod with complete conviction and then walk out the door and change nothing, not because they were insincere in their agreement, but because something between understanding and action failed to fire. Your job as a communicator who wants to move people is to close that gap. Not to inform more thoroughly, but to bridge the specific distance between what someone knows and what they do. Clarity of direction, the first requirement. The most common reason action doesn't follow communication is shockingly simple. People don't know what the action is. They understand the concept, they agree with the principle, but they leave the conversation unclear on what specifically they're supposed to do next. And in the absence of a clear next step, they default to their existing behavior, which is what they were doing before you spoke. Your communication must end with a concrete, actionable step, not a vague aspiration, not a call to. Think about this differently. A specific action, what to do, when to do it, how to begin. Commit to one 10-minute practice conversation this week. Before our next meeting, send me your 3 biggest concerns about the timeline. Today, not next week. Today, send that email. The specificity is not nagging. It's the final yard of the communication journey. Without it, the journey ends yards short of the destination. Emotion is the ignition. Logic organizes. Emotion energizes. If your message lives only in the logical layer of the listener's experience, it will be assessed, considered, evaluated, and often filed without triggering behavior change. Because behavior change doesn't originate in the logic processing brain. It originates in the emotional one. This is why the most effective TED talks, the most motivating speeches, the most persuasive conversations all carry emotional weight, not sentimentality, not manipulation. Genuine emotional truth that connects the message to something the listener cares about deeply. The question to ask when crafting any action-oriented communication is, why should this matter to them emotionally, not intellectually, emotionally? What does this connect to in their hopes, their fears, their identity, their values? When you find that connection and name it clearly, this matters because it's about the kind of team we want to be, or this is about protecting something that really matters to you. The message becomes alive in a way that pure information cannot achieve. Urgency, the enemy of later. Human beings default to later. It's not laziness, it's neurological. The brain's default mode is to conserve resources. Action requires energy, and the brain will not expend that energy unless there's a sufficiently compelling reason to act now rather than later. Without urgency, later becomes tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week, eventually becomes never. Creating urgency doesn't require manufactured pressure or artificial deadlines. It can come from opportunity. This window is open right now, and it closes. From timing, the right moment for this is now before the situation changes. From momentum, we're already moving in this direction. This is the moment to commit fully. Urgency answers the unspoken question the listener's brain is asking. Why now? Give them a real answer to that question, and procrastination loses its default victory, relevance, the personal connection. People take action when they can see, specifically, concretely, how that action connects to their life, to their goals, to their problems, to what they're already trying to do. Abstract benefit doesn't drive action. This will improve organizational efficiency, produces cognitive agreement, and behavioral indifference. This will save you specifically about 3 hours a week on the thing you told me you find most frustrating. That produces a lean forward. Relevance is the bridge between your message and their motivation. And relevance is built by listening before speaking. When you know what someone is struggling with, what they're trying to achieve, what they're worried about, you can connect your message to their actual life, not a generic version of their situation. Reduce friction. Even well-motivated people stop when the path becomes unclear or difficult. Friction is the invisible resistance that kills momentum. Uncertainty about how to begin, fear of failure, complexity that makes the first step feel overwhelming, lack of resources that makes action feel futile. Your job is to remove as much friction as possible from the first step. Break the action down until the starting point is small enough to feel possible, but meaningful enough to matter. Offer tools, resources, or support that reduce the complexity. Normalize the uncertainty. The first step feels unclear for everyone. Here's how to begin anyway. Once someone starts, momentum tends to build. The hardest part is always beginning. Make beginning as easy as possible, and action follows. Create ownership. The final, most powerful driver of action is ownership. When someone participates in shaping what the action should be, when they're asked for input, given choices, invited to adapt the plan to their specific context, the action becomes theirs, not a task assigned to them, a decision they made. People follow through on their own decisions with a force that no external instruction can produce. Because to abandon their own decision is to fail at something they chose, which is cognitively and emotionally costly. Ask, what feels like the right first step to you? Ask, how would you adapt this to your situation? Ask, what do you think would make this work? These questions don't just gather information, they transfer ownership. And ownership is the difference between compliance and commitment. Compliance fades, commitment compounds. Chapter 15. Control the room with silence and timing. We reach the final chapter of this audiobook, and fittingly, it's about the power of not speaking. Silence and timing are the most advanced tools in the communicator's toolkit. They're also the least taught, the least practiced, and the most immediately transformative when they're finally understood and applied. Most people fear silence. They fill it reflexively, automatically, compulsively, with words, with sound, with and so, and anyway. Because silence feels like losing ground. Like the conversation is getting away from them. Like they're failing. But silence, strategically placed, does the opposite. It commands attention. It signals confidence. It creates the conditions for meaning to settle into the listener, and it draws out depth that chatter never can. Why silence is power. When someone is comfortable with silence, when they don't rush to fill every gap, don't panic at every pause, don't scramble to occupy every second of airtime, they communicate something powerful at a nonverbal level. I am not threatened by space. I don't need to fill the air to control it. I'm here, I'm steady, and I'm not going anywhere. That quality, comfort with space, is one of the most reliable markers of genuine authority. Not performed authority. Genuine internal stability. In negotiation, the first side to break a silence typically offers more than they intended. They interpret the silence as dissatisfaction and scramble to address it. The side that holds the silence holds leverage. In teaching, a pause after asking a question invites students to actually think, rather than waiting for the teacher to answer their own question. The pause creates responsibility. In leadership, a considered pause before responding to a difficult question communicates. This deserves real thought. That communication of care and deliberateness is itself a form of authority. Timing, the hidden variable. The content of what you say matters. The timing of when you say it determines whether it's received. Two identical messages, identical words, identical delivery, can produce completely different outcomes depending entirely on the moment in which they're delivered. A correction delivered when someone is already embarrassed compounds the damage. The same correction, delivered after they've had space to recover their composure, is received as helpful. A vision statement delivered when the team is depleted and overwhelmed lands as additional pressure. The same statement, delivered after a success that's rebuilt their confidence, lands as inspiration. Reading timing means reading the room. Not just what's being said, but the emotional weather of the space, the energy level, the tension, the degree of openness or defensiveness in the people you're addressing. When the weather is right, the most important things can be said. When it isn't, even the most carefully crafted message meets a closed door. Great communicators cultivate the patience to wait for the right moment and the sensitivity to recognize it when it arrives. knowing when to stop. Perhaps the most underrated timing skill in communication is knowing when you've said enough. Many powerful messages are diluted by what comes after them. The point lands. The listener feels it. And then the speaker, driven by nervousness or the desire to ensure understanding or simply the habit of filling space, keeps talking. They repeat the point. They qualify it. They add supporting arguments. They over-explain. And in doing so, they pull the listener's attention away from the impact of the point and back into the process of the communication. The moment of maximum force passes. The message loses its edge. Stop at the moment the point lands, not when you run out of words, when the idea has taken root. This is a discipline that feels unnatural at first. The impulse to keep going is strong. But the communicators who have mastered this, who can make their most important point and then simply be quiet, carry a quality of precision that makes every word they speak feel carefully chosen. Because it is cultural sensitivity in silence. A brief but important note. The meaning of silence varies significantly across cultural contexts. In some cultures, many East Asian and Scandinavian contexts, for example, silence in conversation is a form of respect, a signal of serious consideration. In some North American and Southern European contexts, silence can be read as disagreement, discomfort, or social awkwardness. These differences don't invalidate the power of strategic silence. They require that it be applied with cultural awareness. Understanding your audience means understanding not just what they value in content, but what they interpret in form, including the form of silence. The skilled communicator adapts without abandoning their center. They use silence where it will be read as confidence and clarity, and recognize when a different context requires a different rhythm. The integration. Everything in this final chapter, silence, timing, the pause, knowing when to stop, connects to a theme that has run through every chapter of this audiobook. Intention over impulse. Most people communicate on impulse. They speak because they feel the urge to speak. They feel silence because silence makes them uncomfortable. They rush to respond because waiting feels passive. They continue talking because stopping feels like yielding. Powerful communicators communicate from intention. They choose when to speak and when to be quiet. They select timing based on what the moment requires, not what their impulse demands. They allow silence because they know what it creates. They stop at the right moment because they know the effect of stopping. This is the discipline, the inner discipline, that all external communication skill rests upon. And it's a discipline that is always in development. There is no arrived. There is only more practiced, more aware, more intentional. Conclusion: the communicator you are becoming. We've traveled through 15 chapters of one of the most fundamental and most underestimated human capacities, from the internal work of training your mind, to the architecture of framing, to understanding the filters through which your words are received, from the precision of emotional expression, to the power of simplicity, to the profound influence of listening over speaking, from the art of questions, to the truth that your body speaks before your mouth does, to the transformative potential of stories well told, from ethical persuasion to the trust that opens every door, to the boundaries that keep communication sustainable and respectful, from handling conflict as information rather than threat, to moving people from agreement to action, to the commanding, confident use of silence and time. These are not tricks. They're not rhetorical techniques designed to make you sound different from who you are. They're tools for becoming more fully and powerfully who you actually are. In every conversation you have, here's the deepest truth this book offers. Communication is not separate from character. It is character made audible. The way you speak reflects the way you think. The way you listen reflects what you value. The way you handle conflict reflects your relationship with your own ego. The way you express boundaries reflects your respect for yourself. The way you tell stories reflects what you believe about human connection and meaning. To improve your communication is to improve your relationship with yourself and with others, not just as a professional skill. As a human practice, the great advantage is that this practice compounds. Every conversation is a chance to refine. Every interaction offers feedback. Every difficult moment is a teacher. And unlike many other domains of growth, the rewards are immediate, because every person you communicate with better receives the gift of that improvement. The relationship improves. The outcome improves. The understanding deepens. Start where you are. Pick one thing from this audiobook, one insight that felt most alive, most relevant, most immediately applicable to your life. Practice it deliberately. In the next conversation you have, not because perfection is the goal, but because Every degree of improvement in communication is a degree of improvement in the quality of your life and the lives of those around you. Because in the end, what we're really talking about is not how to speak more skillfully. We're talking about how to connect more fully, how to understand more deeply, how to leave every interaction having added something: clarity, trust, understanding, inspiration, resolution that wasn't there before. That is communication as a life practice. That is speaking smart. And you've already begun.